This is the Parents in Sport podcast. Amazing guests, honest conversations, topics that matter.
Welcome to the Parents in Sport podcast. I am your host, Gordon MacLelland, and I'm delighted to be joined today by clinical psychologist, speaker and author, Dr Suzanne Brown. Suzanne, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's only taken us about 5 years, I think, Suzanne, to finally have a conversation, even though we've been meaning to. And before we get into today's topic around managing injury, which I know causes a huge amount of angst for young athletes and parents, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, you've built that up now. It's an eagerly anticipated 5-year conversation. So, yeah, sure. So I am a clinical psychologist. And for those that maybe aren't familiar with the different types of psychologists that are out there, it essentially means that my training was through a process which is focused on mental health and well-being. So you do often an undergraduate degree, a master's degree, and then you do a doctorate. And during that time, you work across the spectrum of the lifespan. So you work with infants and children and adolescents, you work with adults, you work in learning disability, and you work with older adults. And then a little bit after pretty much straight after actually I completed my doctorate, I went on to train as a psychotherapist. And that was another 3 years worth of training. I'm obviously, I love the training. But over the last sort of 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer than that now, I've been applying that into sports. So sports, business and education. And I think it's probably helpful to ground it in my experiences of working with injury do cross from the NHS into sport. So it might be that today I'll draw upon physical injuries like, ACL injury that, is quite common in sport. But I've also worked with obviously psychological injuries that have meant people can't perform at the level that they're wanting to perform at. I might have worked with longer term injuries like issues with, kidney dialysis or autoimmune disorders, and then people that have experienced things like cancer. So I'll be trying to draw across, the kind of broad pool. And I appreciate when we're talking about parents in sport that crosses a big age spectrum too. So we'll try to dig in a bit deeper where we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it'll be fascinating. And I think, injuries obviously can come at different ages and different stages and can potentially mean different things. We know our 3-year-olds are going to get the odd bash on the head and everything else, but that isn't going to cause too much angst as opposed to somebody who's perhaps just signed for a football academy and then ruled out for the next 6 months, for example, which is a very different conversation. So, I mean, children getting injured, obviously tough for children because they hate that. I think back to years in education and boys who were injured and missed games or missed being with their friends and missed being part of something, feeling very isolated was obviously something I remember from my own experiences. But then I think chatting to parents as well around, what do we do to try and enhance the mood of our young people when they're injured? It's not particularly easy. So, what are your thoughts around just injuries in general, children, parents, anything you want to share on that?
Well, it's a cracker of a first question because I think there's so much that's bound up in it. And I do approach this as in my mind, one foot in the camp of being a parent myself, and then another foot as a psychologist, and obviously kind of working with people, working with parents and their children when they're injured. So, I mean, really thinking about, you mentioned a little bit there about isolation, and obviously there is a huge impact around often disconnection, isolation, but ultimately to say that it brings up a lot of feelings in us, right? As parents, it is going to bring up a lot of feelings because that's how we're programmed. I mean, we are literally biologically programmed to nurture our young, and the reason that comes about is we're the most helpless creatures of all the animal kingdom, where children rely on their parents for the longest amount of time. So it makes sense that we are designed to bond and to take care of them. So for me, I think seeing your child at any age injured, whether that is physically or emotionally, it's going to provoke a lot of natural instinctive responses. And I think the other part of it is, because we're built to connect and we're built to empathize, it's inevitable that those closest to us bring up the most intense feelings. So because we can empathize, it means you can tune in and cue into your child. But at other times, I think parents often speak about getting drawn into, getting sucked into that emotional world or that emotional state that their child is going through. So rather than being able to help guide alongside, they really kind of get into the swamp with them, and then they feel just as helpless often. So I do want to say to that point though, we would call this at times in psychology, we have a term for it, which is parallel process. And it's just a fancy way of saying that as humans, we're really quite clever in that we can bring about the same feeling in somebody else that we are experiencing without saying it, right? Without saying, I'm feeling helpless. What that might look like is every time as a parent you try to offer a suggestion, it's rejected, it's turned down, eyes are rolled. You end up feeling pretty helpless as a parent, right? Like, what else can I do? And in a way, what the child is often doing then is giving you the experience, letting you know how they feel, because at times they don't have the words for that, and they really need you to scaffold that for them. So it sounds really simple, but at times just being able to take that in, to digest it and to know what it is yourself, and then reflect that back to your child to say, boy, I'm feeling pretty helpless here. It seems like nothing I'm suggesting is landing, or, I wonder if that's how you're feeling, can do a lot for the child. In many ways, it opens up the potential for them to say, yes, that is what I'm feeling. And now they've got a word for it to put to, a label to their experience. Or they can say, no, that's not what I'm feeling, right? And now there's another avenue. Now they can start to maybe tell you what it is that they're feeling. So I think just to say that that's really common. And then the other thing that I think also comes up a lot when it comes to injury and as a parent is the child feeling quite powerless. And they are connected, but they are slightly different. So you'll often hear when it comes to injury or sport anyway, focusing on what you can control and what you can't control. I'm sure that's been talked about a lot, maybe on your podcast. And that's because we like to see ourselves as having agency. That's another fundamental drive that we have. So we want to be self-determined. We want to feel like we are motivated, that we can have an impact. So when something happens that's outside of our control, it brushes up against that basic need to feel in control, and it can turn it upside down. And I just think, for me, Gordon, there's a lot to be said for, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later on, but actually being able to accept that we have limitations or that we are limited. And I think a lot of the time we can try and fight that. And there can be a narrative in sport, and we can look up to people that, do great things in their career, and they can appear limitless, right? Like they're some kind of superhero and superhuman, but it's not the truth. And so when we're really faced with reality, that we have limits and that we can get injured and that's going to have an impact, being able to deal with reality is so important here. So, yeah. But we might get into that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, God, even your sort of first response opens up lots of things when you think about the sporting world in context. And I always think back to how we almost hear the stories that we want to hear as well when we're talking there about the limitless things. We believe what we want to believe, don't we? There's that element of survivorship bias almost to justify our own behavior, what we deem. So, if that worked for Andy Murray, then that's going to work for my child, or that worked for Tiger Woods and whatever else. Yeah. But actually, those stories are picked out of millions and millions, and there's millions of stories that we never get to hear about. And I think probably injuries is probably one of those as well, unless we hear of people coming back from the most, I guess, debilitating injuries and it's the most heroic thing. We don't actually hear a lot about, oh, well, actually they missed 6 months when they were 14 because they were going through a growth spurt, or they dislocated their shoulder when they were 16 and missed a key trial or a key session. Those stories never seem to really come out unless you obviously really digging into it and looking for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it can, just picking up of what you've said there, I think it can both be helpful. I've worked with a lot of sports psychologists that have talked about creating what might be, termed a resilience wall, or, kind of a role model wall, where you can pick out people that have been injured, right, and have overcome setbacks and difficulties. And you can use that in a really inspiring way. But like you said, I think it doesn't tell the full story. And so we can glamorize the kind of, as you say, that, well, this worked for this person, and therefore let's copy and paste that over here. And what often is missing from that is the turmoil, the pain, the anger, the grief, that they had to grieve whatever hopes and dreams they had for themselves, at the competition that they had to miss out on, or, all of that. So I think we can really use it in a way that can be beneficial and it can be helpful, but I think not before processing the feelings that have come up with having to meet reality, right? That we are now limited, and it might be that I'm out for the whole season because I've torn my ACL, and it means that I'm not going to the Olympics as I had intended. That is really heavy, and people need time to be able to, and space to process the feelings that they have about that, which does link into then, as a parent, your capacity to tolerate and bear those feelings, right? Like if we struggle with loss ourselves, it can be really hard to support somebody through their own loss, because in a way that empathy piece asks that not only do you know your child is experiencing a loss, you have to be in touch with what that feels like too, right? Like, just to know it cognitively is not empathy, that's sympathy. We have to feel the loss to be able to be in touch with that empathic part of us. And if that's something we struggle with, then it makes it really hard. And so as a parent, we might be tempted, and I'm not saying we do this consciously, with this is very much outside of our awareness, but we might be tempted to minimize it, or, it'll be okay, or, it's only 3 months, or it's only 6 months, or to just go straight to thinking about the positive, right? Don't even leave any gap between what's happened and actually how you feel about it. So we have to really be in touch with our capacity to cope with those difficult feelings so that we can support our child to do the same.
Yeah, and I think what you've said there, I think, is definitely one of the most difficult things to do as a sports parent in general, not just around injury, is a number of those behaviours. I'm doing some work at the moment with a friend of yours, Sarah Murray, and we're working on we've got one of our workshops we've done is parent, or sporting parent. Those times where we go into parent mode in a sporting context where it's not really very helpful at all, because the sporting world's different to perhaps what the home world is. But I think all of it ultimately does end up being linked together, because those times in the car when children want to perhaps sit in silence and we struggle with silence and we try to fill it, and then we perhaps, as you say, we perhaps blame, we perhaps make excuses. We perhaps pass it off as not important. Well, of course it's important, because they wouldn't be sat there in silence and upset in the first place. But creating that space, I think, is really difficult for parents unless people taught them through, I guess, being comfortable with silence, understanding some words that they can use, understanding the type of question that they can use, because you'll know this as a parent yourself, there's no manual for it. I think just people talking about it. I mean, if we were creating a manual, I guess, for those dialogues in trying to really tune into what our children are feeling around their injury. What are your main thoughts on that? Is it wait for them to speak? Although that's really difficult for parents. What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Because there is no manual, right? We can't create it. But I guess what it brings to my mind is that there are no two same responses to injury. And so I will often say to parents, and this can kind of blow their mind a bit at the start. And what I mean by it is that no two children have the same parents, even if they're born to the same parents. And what I mean by that is that your relationship with each child is uniquely different to your other child. Let's say if you have two children, based on their personality, your personality, how well you get along, right? What kind of is created between the gap of you and them. So even if you had two children in the same family that experienced injury, as a parent, you would likely have different reactions, or you would relate to them in different ways. But silence is a really interesting one. And I think for many reasons, silence can communicate a lot in actually the silence. It can represent a lot. It could be about withholding. If you think about the silent withholding, if we bring this up to maybe even adult level, right? Partner to partner, you might shut down, you might detach, you might pull away. That might be about withholding. It might be about a fear response. It might be because you don't have the words to communicate what it is that you want to say. You're kind of, again, in that thick of it, in the swamp, and you kind of feeling it, but you don't have the words to put it into something. So you're acting it out. So it's not a one size fits all. The silence will be so unique and individual, but sometimes it might be about just reflecting on what you're seeing, as simple as, I noticed that you've been really quiet, or at times I'll often say about using that information that you are feeling to kind of guide the conversation. So, as the example I gave earlier on, I'm feeling helpless. Is that how you're feeling? All of a sudden opens up a dialogue. And it might be that you just get a no, but don't underestimate the power of that, because I think what is being communicated to the child is, I'm interested in you. I see that you're quiet, right? Even if they're not engaging back in that dialogue, it's still communicating to them, I care, right? I'm interested in you, and I don't have all the answers. And actually that can also be very normalizing. Other parents might find ways of, and again, it's a delicate balance, isn't it, between not making it totally about you as the parent, but sharing their own experiences of their own setbacks, or, I found this really tough and this is how I overcame it. And like I say, that is delicate, because you don't want it to be all then about you and you're kind of ignoring your child in that. But yeah, I think there's many ways to approach it, but as parents, you often know your children the best. So I think being guided by your kind of compass as a parent.
Yeah, and I think that bit around, sometimes our children, particularly as they get a bit older, look as though they really don't care what we're saying and we absolutely know nothing about the world, but actually they still massively imitate and role model us, even if so I guess there's something in that. If we're showing empathy or showing that we care and are understanding, even though we may not get it back directly, they will understand the feeling that we do care deep down, and perhaps will revisit it later on. I mean, I've had to work really hard at this, Suzanne. I'm sat here sounding as though I know I'm an expert on it on the parenting front, but in my own sports parenting, even talking about it, you're still aware that it's a real challenge all the time. It's just that awareness piece.
Yeah, no, it's huge. And the other thing is to normalize that it's not perfect parenting, right? That actually equals a well-rounded, robust child. The studies show we can get it wrong 50% of the time. That's huge, right? Like 50% of the time, I could get this interaction with my child wrong. What's more important than the rupture is the repair. Do I come back to repair it? And people that repair it go on to have children that have really healthy, secure attachments, right? Which essentially means that they can explore the world and kind of take risks that are appropriate, and then come back and ask for help when they need it. So often, you know, I think we can also as parents get caught up, and I know this is something I revisit time and time again in my own therapy, about preventing the bad thing from happening, right? I think they call it like helicopter parenting or lawnmower parenting, where you're kind of trying to get rid of the issue before it arises. And again, that's not the healthy thing to do, because it doesn't teach your child that they will survive something bad happening, right? But actually our ability to go back and say, hey, you know what, I'm sorry, that was about me, that wasn't about you, again models just, you know, our willingness to be human and that we aren't perfect. But it gives them, as you said, this this kind of template of, actually, this is what it means to be a kind of well-rounded adult. You know, this is what I'm kind of growing into. And it is really important, like you said, they don't just do what we say, they do watch what we do, more so than really what we're saying. So if you're incompatible, you know, if you're inconsistent and it is do what I say, not as I do, they're not going to be following that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm feeling a whole heap better about it, because I think I've got I've got a chance now at 50% wrong. I think now close to actually achieving something rather than being a million miles off. So that's
the odds feel a bit better, right?
Which is great. But you know, and that's, I think that's a really important thing for us just to mention to parents listening, that there is no such thing as perfection, and we talk a lot about this in workshops. It's never going to exist. It really isn't. And you know, we've got to show some compassion to ourselves, and as you say, because there isn't one size fits all. I think finding what works well for us is really important. You know, we talk lots about car journeys home, how children want to speak on potentially the way to games. What about when things have gone wrong? And actually, I think you find the right method that works for you and your child, but you're going to have to go through it together and come up with something that works. I mean, my car journeys home in the early stages with my children were horrific. I mean, you know, I'll be very open about it, because my perception of the world of sport was very different to theirs, and I've had to get better and better at it. And luckily now with my 10-year-old daughter, she announced to me that it's great that daddy's going to watch sport, but there's going to be no car bossing, was how she described it. So it's been a lot easier with her, because she basically told me how it was going to be, which actually was better than just sort of making up your own rules the first time round with my older son. But it just shows you how hard it is.
Yeah, and figuring it out in the dark, and you know what, like figuring it out together, I think that's such an important thing. You know, we can often talk about feedback, you know, in terms of the workplace, and seeking out feedback from our peers or our colleagues or our manager. But I wonder how often we do seek out feedback from our children. And so I've heard of stories where parents will outrightly say, I want some feedback on my parenting, right? Now, that might not feel like the language or the way that you would communicate it for you, and that's okay. But there's something about this element of being proactive about our communication and being willing to hear the tough stuff, right? Like, maybe it didn't feel good to be hearing that you weren't going to be a car boss on the way, you know, like that might sting a bit, but that actually we can take it, and that your daughter clearly feels comfortable enough that you can take that sort of feedback. And then it means that you get a better conversation at a time that's going to work maybe for her, and she's going to be able to open up a bit more. But it means that you might have to, by the sounds of it, hold back on that bit that might want to talk about it or digest it on the way home. So yeah, it's really kind of navigating that space together.
Yeah, what I didn't add to that was the first sentence followed by, but I'll have some tips if you've got any. So with my background in sport, she wasn't stupid enough to say, I don't want to hear anything from you. So actually, if there's anything that's going to make me look a little bit better, I'm prepared to listen to that. But you need to be very careful how you give me that information. think was the gist of a 10-year-old's 2 sentences there. So I've been working hard on that.
She needs to be on this podcast. It sounds like she's a wise woman.
Oh, I mean, it would be very funny having her on. She has a performance cricket pathway and is quite a good footballer as well. She would be very entertaining on this.
Yeah, I bet.
My 2 children on, as I speak to parents all around the world, get somebody in with us and ask some real questions for what's on and what's good. That could make a really good episode.
Yeah, the kids get away with asking whatever the hell they want. So yeah.
That would be good. That would be interesting. I might explore that. I think this one around injury, going back to the injury piece, it definitely gets way harder, as we said earlier, when injury happens around trials, selection, competition. I guess a fear from parents that their children are then going to miss out. I guess that fear that they're going to get left behind, a lot of those emotions, and perhaps is a time where maybe parental behaviours become a bit out of kilter, maybe because it is just too much. The sheer fact that, you know, we know how disappointed our children are going to be and what that means for them. What can we do to make parents feel a little bit better about it, if that is at all possible? And what can they do at this stage to support their children?
Yeah. Well, I think this may be tough listening, but it's also what we know, at least is out there in the literature. And I think it's important to know it, that when, you know, there's been studies that have looked at, it's slightly different, but studies that have looked at children who have been through an injury that's involved a burn, and they've monitored the parent's response and the impact on the child. So if the parent shows more distress and anxiety, what happens is that the child is more distressed and they report higher levels of pain, as opposed to the parent that actually is feeling more contained, isn't really kind of, as you were saying, kind of off kilter or spilling out in that way where their anxiety is really overwhelming and consuming them. They're able to then provide this kind of stability for the child, which actually not only then reduces the pain that they're feeling, but it also was linked to how quickly wounds healed, right? I mean, it's just incredible if you think about it. But there's a real reality then to parents being very self-aware about how their anxiety is affecting them. And it's not to say that they are not going to feel anxious, right? Or that they don't experience anxiety or feel pain at their child really genuinely missing out. Because I think it goes back to that point of facing reality, Gordon, right? That actually, if you've missed selection or you now can't compete in something that was really important to you, that's a reality. And so rather than, again, getting kind of sucked up into our own anxiety about that, or like you say, it might then lead to a lot of behavior that is, often clubs might say, you know, I've got a really anxious parent and they're phoning all the time. And I think, again, there's a balance to be had between really open communication with the club in terms of thinking about how you can help your child at that point in time, versus being able to look at, as a parent, how can I contain this anxiety? Where's the right space? Where's the right support system for me to take those fears and worries so that I can come back into that relationship with my child and I can provide the robustness for them so that they can fall apart if they want to, right? In a way that we are constantly checking out from our parents just how much they can take. And then we get the permission either to fall apart and let all of our feelings out, or we get, again, it might be much more subtle, it's not explicit, but we get the sense that, you know what, mum and dad can't handle this, so I'm going to push that away. I'm going to hide that. And that really leads to very bad outcomes, right? Because if you think about injury again, we know that when people are injured, there is this correlation between more likely to experience depression. And then if you think about the impacts on that in terms of recovery, it can really prolong recovery. But it also, when you look at people going back into sport, if they have not dealt with things like the apprehension and fear of getting re-injured, or their feelings about the injury itself. So one study with people who had had an ACL injury looked at when they hadn't processed and dealt with this fear of re-injury, they were 13 times more likely to get re-injured within the next 2 years. So, I mean, it has a knock-on effect. So I think community and support is really important for the parents. Like, who do they go to talk about their worries and their fears? Is it that when I've run sort of workshops with parents before, they found that really helpful to be there as a collective, as a group of parents, just to voice that, just to say, like, this is what I'm scared about, or this is what I'm dealing with, or it's really hard to see my son feeling really isolated whilst all his friends are, going on to play in these cup games, and he's benched, or he's not even on the bench at this point, he's in rehab. And then there are the practical things too. So I was recently speaking with Thomas Gardner over at Aston Villa. I'd posted something about isolation on Twitter, and he got in touch and we had a conversation. And he was saying, look, there are ways, obviously, that you can practically change things for people. You can bring out the rehab equipment to the pitch side so they do still feel part of the team and connected. There are things that you can do in terms of adapting schedules so that actually you're still making sure that everybody is eating together, whether that's breakfast or lunch or whatever it might be. But ultimately, we could also see that for one person that may have really helped and alleviated the isolation that they were feeling, but for another person, didn't make a difference. So again, it is so nuanced. It is so unique and individual to the person that we've got to really pay attention to the person in front of us and work out what it is for them that they need.
Yeah, I think that bit you were talking about, and I've seen this actually, even just observing, around different sports, sometimes the fears and anxieties of young people, you can actually see it through the traits of mum and dad. There's almost the fear before they've even started to play. And it's almost like the parents have created the fear. There might be a problem, but they've exacerbated the fear by the things that they've perhaps said, or how they, like you say with the burns, they've made a bigger deal of something than it actually is. And then I think that can have an impact on the performance of the child as well.
Yeah, but that is how we transmit emotions. It's emotional contagion, right? That is literally the nature of what we do. We bring about these feelings. So again, being able to really pay attention and regulate ourselves. And like I said, it's not about shutting that down. I think you do need a space to take that to explore what that's bringing up for you, the fear of the injury or the loss, or how is it that you can help your child through that when maybe it's brushing up against, you don't like to deal with sadness, or you don't like to deal with anger, and actually you kind of shut that down. Those are all normal emotions that people are going to feel when they're injured. And then just as an aside, I think as a parent, what is really vital, right from birth, we crave some level of consistency, right? So we can handle a lot of change, right? That's the beauty of being humans. We're adaptive. So we're built to adapt and change, providing we often have something that is consistent. So I will often speak about the fundamentals here being things like sleep and nutrition. And they are really important when it comes to injury, because we, again, know they tend to go out the window, right? I'm sure you've had a lot of parents, or if your children, have been injured themselves, actually their whole routine is thrown out of whack. And they're so used to being on kind of a regimented schedule that all of a sudden it throws up a lot of chaos and uncertainty. So it has an impact in many ways, partly because we know that people who don't get enough sleep are much more hypersensitive and reactive, up to 60% more than somebody who's getting a good night's sleep, getting the amount of sleep that they need. So if you're thinking about mood, you really do want to continue to kind of keep a boundary around that. And he would say, Matthew Walker, who did a lot of this research, would say that sleep itself can be emotional first aid for people, so that we process a lot of what we're going through emotionally through things like our dreams, right? Like we it gives us the opportunity to digest it, to integrate it, and maybe to even deal with some of that painful part. It takes the edge off the painful part because we're processing it through our dreams. So if you can, as much as possible, maintain a consistent schedule around sleeping and eating, I think that's really vital for your children.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point around sleep, nutrition, trying to, I guess, keep to some form of routine that can go out of the window. What can children do to really help themselves during these periods of injury? And I guess is our role just as parents just to almost be facilitators to support that, as long as obviously our children are trying to do the right things?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think it's going to depend on how much you might need to genuinely advocate for your child, right? Like dependent on their age and things. But if we're talking about maybe an adolescent, or ideally, I think at any age, you want to be able to try and help to empower your children to, genuinely listen to their bodies. So one of the things that I often will talk about with athletes themselves actually is this tendency that by the time they are adults, they've been often told to ignore signals that are coming from their body, to play through injury, play through pain, play through fatigue, and inevitably, just kind of looking at kind of clinically who I see, they do tend to get injured more, right? Because they're ignoring these signals from their body. So the more we can empower children from a very young age to communicate and speak up about exactly what's going on, I think that is really important. You often do face, and I've experienced this myself before, when I've worked with people who are so eager to get back into the game that they might overtrain, or that they might not quite follow the rehab as intended. So again, it's a tricky little dance, but I think checking in with what's motivating that and trying to understand that's really important, rather than just coming down with a punishment for that. So for children and maybe older adolescents, really communicating proactively. So I've found when we've worked in clubs, one of the things that they might do is do something called like a player pack, or it's essentially like an emotional fitness survey at the start of the season. But what you're really inviting in then is the communication before an event, before an injury, before something difficult happens. And you might ask things like, when I'm injured, I like to be supported, ... And it might be that I actually do want constant check-ins from my teammates and my coaches, or it might be, I like to be given more space. Or when I'm feeling down, this is what helps, ... And so you start to build up a picture of somebody, and you've got information there before you actually need it. Because as we all found through the pandemic, we all kind of experienced this globally, that it wasn't expected. And, we all went through a very difficult time, and having that information there, can be better than in the moment trying to communicate something when you're already then dealing with a lot. The other thing, I guess, is to say that often athletes are very driven with goal setting. So, they've kind of really tapped into that competitive nature, and it does a lot for them. And so one thing that we did during the pandemic, but it came from our strength and conditioning coaches and kind of the sports science team, was they created these new micro goals. So they had like a points-based system. And what I really liked about this was you could compete against yourself. So the target is you've got to get 100 points a day. Or obviously, when we were all in the pandemic, you were tapping into that healthy competition between teammates, where you might be trying to get more points, but it was really around a variety of things. So it might be, say, you get 10 points per activity, and one 10 point might be, I spent 10 minutes trying to learn a new language, or I shared with somebody something that I was grateful for, or a win today. And essentially, it's kind of like a way of then building up these small wins that can help people stay motivated, help people stay on track, but taps into that kind of competitive nature that they have. So that went down a treat at our club, and it really, again, facilitated that community and connection, because I think that is one of the biggest things that you hear people talk about, like they don't feel like they belong anymore. They're on the periphery. And that's a really both, a difficult and dangerous place to be when you're on the periphery and you don't feel part of the team, if it's a team sport, that is. But, so many people come out of injury having acquired a new skill. And I know they don't see it like that going in. But the capacity to kind of approach your recovery with the same mentality that you do as an athlete can be really useful.
Yeah, I think, as I said to you, we were getting close to sort of wrapping up this episode, but you've probably opened up quite a few interesting bits there that I think are particularly important to parents and anyone that's been involved in sport, is that it's really important that we are patient around injury, because in trying to rush and trying to take shortcuts with the rehab and thinking that we're achieving more than we actually are, the longer term impact of that is potentially a lot worse than the short term pain that we're currently suffering. Yeah, it's really tempting, isn't it? It is tempting.
So tempting. And I think you pick up on a really great point, which is it's about that perspective, isn't it? So our ability to, and again, I think sports psychologists will use the language around zooming in and out. But there's a lovely way that you can bring this to life. And I've done this with people in injury and outside of injury. And again, I think parents can do this, children can do this themselves, but it's nice to do it alongside someone, which is to visually represent that perspective. So one way of doing that can be either getting a piece of string or a piece of rope, or people might draw it, and you do a timeline. And on that timeline, if you're thinking that you're working with like a 15-year-old boy or girl, then if we're saying, let's say their lifespan might be to 85, you've got this big chunk of string or rope that represents everything that's to come, right? Like that 15 years takes up a very small amount of the piece here. But you can look at then, it's a way of giving perspective and to think and to introduce things like what you're talking about there, which is, yes, you might rush through that, but what might be the impact then on this later bit of string or this later bit of rope? And again, to kind of bring it to life, really, because the temptation is there, right? Of course, they're craving being with their friends, they're craving to compete again, to be, on the team, to be selected. It gives them such a lot in terms of personal satisfaction. So it's hard. It is a real loss to be injured and on the sideline with that. But to provide that perspective, I think, is really important, to look at actually this is this current part of your life right now, and look at all of this that's yet to come. The decisions that we make right now are going to impact on that. And again, to kind of not be overly serious about that, but just to be realistic about it.
Yeah, I think the wider perspective is important across a lot of this sports parenting journey. And then the other bit, that the reality, I think, if we're being really honest with parents, is rehab and injury is so boring. I know people have made exciting ways, but generally as a rule, compared to what would be necessarily normal training and interactions, it can be really boring. So I think, encouraging our children where possible to have some variety in their rehab, as you say, to keep it nice and fresh so it's not the same, or even potentially not necessarily rehab, but encourage our children to perhaps pursue some other interests. Certainly for those involved in performance sport, great opportunity to catch up on some schoolwork when things have you've been so busy and you haven't been able to do it. Or even look at aspects, I guess, of your performance that you don't normally have the time to. So maybe a little bit more around sort of technical analysis, or learn parts of the game that obviously you don't normally have the time to do, but now it presents that opportunity. I think just thinking like that could certainly help our children.
Yeah, 100%. And I've worked with people that are older, that have kind of taken a camper van and gone traveling around, you know, when they're long-term injured and actually there's very little that's happening. And as you mentioned at the start, it's really meant kind of they've been signed for a club and then they've incurred an injury, and actually it's meant that you know, pretty soon after, or well, after the kind of attempts to recover, the contract ended and they weren't able to play for the club. You know, they have used that opportunity to rent a camper van and go traveling, or that's very different to, say, a 15-year-old who's also maybe preparing for GCSEs and, you know, doesn't have that kind of opportunity just to go traveling. But it's all relative, right? Which is what you're saying. So how can this person make the most of this opportunity? And again, see it as, I was saying, you know, at the start, people don't often view it as an opportunity. They are often stuck in the negative aspect of it. And I think that's why we need to help people to process that so that they can move on to that next stage. But it's like, if you try and bypass that, that's where it lingers and that's where you get stuck. And I think that's where you are more likely to see things like depression coming up, or, you know, the anxiety that's just persistent and it's not going away because it's not been dealt with. So if we can do that first part of, you know, providing the space to process what people are feeling, then naturally people are pretty good. You know, like I said, we're resilient, we're adaptive, we're pretty good at bouncing back. And often it can be a watch and wait scenario where we actually don't need to intervene. They naturally will come up with this. I had one guy that I worked with that was a young lad who was actually facing potentially the end of career. There was a kind of heart condition that they were looking into. And he was saying, you know, I've started to learn to cook and I've started to do that. You know, these didn't come from me. These weren't my suggestions. These were things that he decided to do, but he'd been given the space to process, first of all, the disappointments, the anger, the loss of what was going on. And then naturally, he came up with the things that he was interested in and other sports that were taking his interest and that he could spend time, as you say, getting into and or looking into.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've covered an incredible amount in this episode, and the more that I think I do work with parents, and the more I talk about this with more and more people, I think, as we've said so many times, there definitely isn't a manual for how we handle all of these things. But I think the more that we can make ourselves self-aware and we can provide options for parents, not tell them how to do it, but just provide a number of different avenues that they can use, they can shape, they can adapt, that works for them in their context. Because it's all very well us saying lots of variety of things, but some people's work commitments may not allow that. They may not have facilities nearby. It's not always straightforward. But actually just that wider understanding, few thoughts, ideas, I think's real gold dust to people. And you know, thank you for sharing an amazing amount of knowledge today on, as we said at the very beginning, one of definitely the most challenging things of sports parenting, and that's supporting our children through injury and through their recovery. So, Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us on the Parents in Sport podcast, and hopefully we'll get you on again very soon.
You're really welcome. Thank you again. And thanks for sharing your experiences and bringing it to life.
Thank you for listening. Check us out at parentsinsport.co.uk.